Good morning, everybody. Wow, this is great. So glad to see so many people here. I am excited to get us started. So, welcome to the session, The Science of Reading and Foundational Skills Simplified. Uh, Quick note, if you have access to the handouts, we use a little system where occasionally I may have a slide in my deck that you don't have in the handouts. That slide will have a red title like the one here. There are a couple of slides that I will not talk about, but that I put in the handout, and they're labeled reference slides. They're just there for your reference. In an hour, there's only so much I can talk about, but I wanted to share some additional information, and I'll point those out when they come up. I have several objectives to try to squeeze into this hour and 15 minutes. We'll do my best. I'll do my best to cover it all. First objective is to have you guys understand the essence of the science of reading. Science of reading is a big term we're all hearing now. I believe in trying to keep things simple, so we're going to see if we can get to the essence of it. I want you guys to understand the importance of the simple view of reading, which is a critical, pivotal piece of research that's at the heart of the science of reading. I'm going to give you guys our map of foundational skills, excuse me, get my mouth going this morning, to teach. And then I'm going to also share a map or a flow chart for thinking about diagnostic assessment so you will know where your students are and what you do need to teach. And then lastly, I want to share some thoughts about something that I've noticed that people don't always have a clear understanding of, which is the difference between mastery and automaticity. So, what do we know from the science of reading? I'm going to boil down a few thoughts from the huge body of research that is the science of reading that I think are essential for teachers to keep in mind as they approach reading instruction. First of all, what is the science of reading? Well, as many people are as in this chat, we may have that many definitions of the science of reading, as in so many things in academia. There's not a fixed definition. On the slide is one that I came across from my friends Nancy Eberhardt and Cheryl Folito at SoR that I think gets pretty close to being a good, solid definition of the science of reading. So I'm not going to read that to you, but it's there. I will point out that in their definition, they refer to a vast body of research. So we know that it's scientific research. And what is it scientific research about? Well, skills, how the skills work, and what part of the brains are responsible for proficient reading and the development of proficient reading. By the way, sortagories, when I talk about automaticity and mastery at the end, is a wonderful resource for practice to develop automaticity. So check it out. My goodness. Guys, I've been talking to you and you couldn't hear me. I apologize.
No, that just the second happened. You're good.
Oh, okay. Sorry. How did I get muted? Okay. So things we know from the science of reading. Proficient reading is a learned behavior. We are not born with reading ability. We're not born with it's not a natural thing. We have to learn it. And we actually co-opt or retrain parts of our brain that have evolved for other purposes to develop the reading brain. So we start out as non-readers. We have to begin to learn to read. We become advanced readers. And then finally, we become proficient readers. Our brains are wired for acquiring language. We are predisposed to learn the language that we are exposed to once we're born. And actually, there's some evidence that even before we're born, we start tuning into the language that's spoken around us. But reading is a made-up thing that humans invented. And as I said, we co-opt or adapt parts of our brain that evolve for different purposes to develop the reading brain. I'm a visual learner, so I'm going to be trying to share some graphics here that I created for myself to help me try to understand what I'm trying to get at here today. So we're going to look at this progression from non-reader to proficient reader and start to think about what are some of the steps along the way, how it try to organize the whole concept of learning to read around some visual images. Where's my clicker? Here we go. So another thing we know from the science of reading is that all proficient readers, so all good readers, use exactly the same set of skills and neural processes to read. So with what we're able to do now in science with looking at live brains and being able to measure blood flow and activity in live brains, scientists are able to see what goes on in a proficient reading brain while the reader is reading. And when they look at different reading brains, they all are activating the same pathways. So somehow, all good readers developed these pathways and these neural processes to become readers. And it's the same in brains. So we don't have different reading brains. We all have the same reading brain. Now, how they develop may vary. We don't know. Some people learn quickly and easily. Some people seem to learn naturally. And some people need explicit instruction, and some people need really explicit, slow and possibly difficult instruction. It varies. There's a wide range of brains, yet in the end, if they become proficient brains, they're all going to be the same reading brain. So what we know from science is that somehow all of proficient readers have developed the same set of skills and the same neural processes, but they've developed them to mastery and automaticity. And towards the end of this talk, I'm going to come back and visit mastery and automaticity. They are not synonymous terms. They are two different terms that have slightly different meanings. And that will become important when we think about the progression of moving to becoming a proficient reader. Mastery and automaticity require lots of practice and repetition. And I highlight that because I think this is one of the areas where we do tend to lose some of our readers, beginning readers, our learning readers. They don't get enough practice to develop the mastery and then the automaticity that's required to really be proficient readers. What else do we know from the science of reading? Well, we know that the simple view of reading, which is a critical, pivotal piece of research, tells us that the set of skills and the neural processes, the things that make up a proficient reading brain, fall into two equally important domains. And if you know the simple view, you'll know that that is word recognition. And word recognition is the ability to see print and to instantly turn it into words in our brain. So a proficient reader will see print, and if it's actual English, if you're an English reader, that the word will instantly just appear in their brain. Seems like magic, but it's not. And we know from science exactly how that happens. But you see the print and it becomes language. And you guys, as good readers, if I expose you to print that isn't English, but uses the same alphabet that we have, your brain will try its hardest to automatically turn that into language. So I can show you nonsense words, and if they follow English spelling patterns, you'll have a pretty good sense of how to pronounce those, even if you don't know what they mean. Or if I show you an unfamiliar word that you've never seen before, your brain will instantly start trying to turn that into a spoken word within your brain. That's the word recognition side. Meaning is not involved in that side for the most part. It's just turning print into language. The second domain is language comprehension, which is the ability to understand spoken language. So in our case, we're talking about English learners, English readers. We're talking about the English language. So how well can you understand and use the English language? So these two domains everything that goes into proficient reading falls within these two main domains. And so when we think about reading instruction, this becomes important because we have to think about which of these domains are we trying to develop? What are the skills that are within these domains? And we're going to talk about that. And where are we within the logical sequence of developing those skills and pathways in the brain? So the simple view of reading is, as I said, a pivotal piece of research. It was first introduced back in 1986, so it's been around for a long time. And I would say that it really is at the heart of the science of reading. So if you want a simple answer to what is the science of reading, you can say, well, it starts with the simple view of reading. So what is the simple view of reading? Well, Goff and Tunmer said that we know that word recognition or decoding is got to be important because you got to turn the print into language if you're going to be a good reader. But you also have to understand the words once you have translated the print into language in your brain. You have to be able to understand it. So understanding the language has got to be important. They said, let's test and see if we can figure out how important decoding is and how important language comprehension is. And so what they proposed is that if you take a score for a student for their ability to recognize words in print, so their decoding ability, their word recognition ability, you have that score. You take that score times a score for their language comprehension. So how well can they understand the language? You can predict what a reading comprehension score would be for that student. So they actually took the complex thing called reading and turned it into a simple mathematic formula, hence the simple view. Now, we all know reading is not simple. It's very complex. The set of skills and processes is vast and very intricate, but they boiled it down to this formula, and then they tested it. And what they found was that most of the time, if you knew a student's word recognition score and you took that times their language comprehension score, you could pretty well predict their reading comprehension score. But the key to this formula is that it's a times relationship. It's not a plus. So it's not adding their word recognition to their language comprehension. It's a times relationship. And if you want to understand how this formula works in math, what the best score you can get on a test would be 100%. In terms of the formula, that would be the number 1. So if you want a number 1 over here in the formula for 100% for reading comprehension, if you know your basic math, word recognition times language comprehension, well, that has to be a 1 times a 1 to get a 1 over here. If your word recognition is only at 50%, that would be a 0.5. Even if your language comprehension is 1, you're only going to get a 0.5 over here. So this is the pivotal thing, that it takes both word recognition and language comprehension, both have to be as good as possible to get good reading comprehension. They do not make up for each other. And this is counterintuitive. We tend to think, oh, teach to their strengths and that'll make up for their weaknesses. But in this case, it doesn't work. Both have to be equally strong. And that's the really, really important part to understand of the simple view, is that you cannot ignore either side of this equation. I mean, either side of these two variables. And I do see occasionally now in discussions going on in the reading world that, you know, because we've made this or are making this shift to what's called the science of reading, people tend to think science of reading is only the word recognition side, and it is not. There's a huge body of research on the language comprehension side, and that's still growing and will continue to grow. And the science of reading is about good reading, which involves both sides. And so instruction will have to include both sides. We're not going to ignore language comprehension for the sake of word recognition, but by the same token, we cannot only teach language comprehension. So I think it's really important to recognize that the science of reading is not just phonics. The science of reading is the entire reading brain, which includes both these big domains. If you go to our website at www.readsters.com, there is a free article that will tell you more about the simple view of reading. We do a whole session on it that I can't obviously do in this time frame. There's a recorded session there that you can access too. So if you want to explore the simple view of reading more, feel free to check it out. It's all free. So now I want to go back to my little graphic of our progressing reading brain from non-reader to proficient reader. And I'm going to add in these two big domains that we've just mentioned, the language comprehension and the word recognition. And so I'm representing those as two continuous bars of learning that are going to run across. And we know that, oops, go back. We know that language comprehension starts before students come to school. It starts at birth and maybe even before birth a little bit, and continues throughout life, we hope. We hope you continue to develop and grow in what you know about the world and understand through language. So language comprehension continues throughout life. Word recognition typically doesn't start until students enter school. In some cases, it starts before, depending on how much preschool and how much parents read to children. But typically, we think of it in terms of at least instruction, starting in either pre-K or kinder, and then developing, we hope, throughout life, because if you're a good reader and you continue to read, you are continually improving your word knowledge, your world knowledge, and your comprehension. So it can continue. But once the basic pathways, the neural pathways for word recognition are established to automaticity, that becomes fixed, and all you're really adding is more content and more words to the reading brain. We mustn't forget writing. Writing should be included in reading instruction and go along with it, and writing skills should develop right in tandem with word recognition skills. So even in the beginning of word recognition, when we're learning about the alphabet, learning our letters and then learning our letter sounds, we should be learning to write the letters and let that become an automatic and process as well. And then as we learn to read, we learn to spell. And then as we get enough spelling under our belts and enough reading under our belts, we should begin to start actually writing sentences and then ultimately writing, bodies of text. So that should parallel and continue right along with the word recognition. So we're getting a map here of starting to think about how to develop a proficient brain, reading brain. Want to just go back to the simple view because it is so important, and just make note that Hunmer and Hoover, who were involved in the study, the original studies on the simple view, excuse me, have revisited it in 2019. They went back and kind of reviewed the simple view in light of all the research that had happened since 1986. And of course, they found out that it holds up quite well. In fact, I would say there are probably hundreds, if at least hundreds of studies that have confirmed the simple view reading. So it's a given in the world of science of reading. But when they did go back, they also kind of looked at it and added to that simpleness of just language comprehension and word recognition making reading comprehension. And they broke down language comprehension into some skills that make up language comprehension and delineated those for us. And in word recognition, they also broke down the skills that underlie the word recognition domain. So you can see, even though it's a simple view at the top, it becomes more and more complex the further you drill down into it. And all of this information informs what we should be teaching. Because all of these things that are listed here are the things that students need to learn to become a proficient reader. And so therefore, we probably need to teach all of this. Not even probably, we must, because students have to learn it. A note about terms. In the original Simple View, they used the word decoding. Over time, decoding has evolved in the world of science of reading to actually talk about the learning word recognition stage, the beginning of learning to read, when students are still kind of having to actively sound out words and they don't automatically just look at print and quickly turn it magically into words. So when we think about foundational reading, we're really, the key in the word recognition side is going to be teaching decoding, teaching students to become automatic at word recognition. Once they've developed that basic set of pathways, and those pathways are starting to become automatic, we move into what is the word recognition stage, which is what a proficient reader has already. And I'm going to map this for you in just a second. But word recognition, in the revisit of the Simple View, the researchers changed the term decoding in the formula to the term word recognition, because when they're looking at in the Simple View, they are looking at a developed reading brain, or a brain that's along the way to becoming developed. And so the domain is the whole package of word recognition, not just the beginning learning stage. And sometimes word recognition can also be referred to as the consolidation stage, the middle stage between decoding and a final proficient reader. So if we go back to my graphic, we're going to see that we've got language comprehension, we've got the word recognition stage, but the early part would be decoding. This is where you're, first matching letters and sounds and doing sounding out and developing, being able to quickly look at words and in print and understand, or to turn them into language. And then of course, writing will go alongside that. So we're just refining our graphic a little bit there. Okay. Let's go and talk about language comprehension for a second. Language comprehension, as I said, starts before school and should continue throughout life. But if you are not a reader, you're going to have to learn about the language orally. So until students become reasonably proficient at reading, they are going to have to acquire their language comprehension through oral language. This can be using written language in read alouds or echo reading and things like that. But when students cannot read the text themselves, they obviously, if they're going to get access to the content that might be in a text, it's going to have to be oral until they're able to read it on their own. So we start learning with oral language, and then once a student has developed a certain ability to read, they can start to read to develop their language comprehension. So again, just getting a little more detailed on our map here and the progression to proficient reading. Many of you probably know the Scarborough Rope, which represents the progression of reading. And with Hollis's permission, I color-coded it to match the color coding from the Simple View, the revisited Simple View. So she actually, Hollis Scarborough, developed this metaphor for learning to read before the Simple View was even proposed. So the rope actually predates the Simple View, although it's a beautiful picture of what's going on in the Simple View. And what Hollis Scarborough represented in the rope is the two domains. So we've got language comprehension and we've got word recognition. And she called it word recognition, interestingly enough. And what she did in her metaphor here is she represented all the skills that go into these two domains as strands of yarn that have to develop individually at first, and then as they start to develop, they can start interacting with each other and reinforcing each other, and they become woven to develop a stronger or a strand or rope. And then eventually the two big ropes also start to interact once students are reading well enough to be able to get content from reading on their own. And that builds their language comprehension, which also builds their proficiency in reading. And over time, the ropes get stronger and stronger and tighter and tighter. Now, when she published this, she had been using this to teach teachers this metaphor for a long time. And then it eventually got published. Something somehow got left out, which was that this is a progression over time. So it's showing from early grades to upper grades the development of proficient reading, which is different than the simple view. The simple view is a static model because it's based on an assessment and can only represent what's happening in that reading brain at that given time, and doesn't really tell us about teaching reading. It tells us what goes into becoming a proficient reader, but it doesn't really talk about how to develop a proficient reader. The rope is more about how to develop this proficient reader out here at the end. So what Hollis showed us was that language becomes increasingly strategic as students develop their background knowledge, their vocabulary, and higher order thinking skills. So as they learn more about the world and learn more language to understand the world around them, their language skills grow. And that starts with oral instruction, as I said, and then eventually will shift to reading instruction once students have the ability to read on their own. And that's somewhere in here where the two start to connect and overlap, and then through time they become and reinforce each other. But I think it's another wonderful graphic that shows that there are these two big domains. They're complex, but overall would both have to be strong, because if there's a weakness in any one of these yarns and that weakness never gets fixed, the rope is compromised by that weakness and it won't fix itself. So another takeaway from all of this is, if we're thinking about foundational skills, in the early grades, before students have developed enough of their skills, the two domains are separate types of instruction. So when we are teaching beginning decoding, we can't be teaching language comprehension because we don't have enough strength in the decoding to be able to also think about developing the language comprehension, and vice versa. You can't do language through reading because you can't read yet. So that is, I think, really critical to think about in our foundational skills learning and teaching. So let's boil down some important lessons from our both the simple view and the rope. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Strong reading requires both strong word recognition and strong language comprehension. They cannot, the one cannot make up for the other. Both have to be equally strong. Okay, I think I saw a question come in. I'll address that in just 1 second. Word recognition cannot be made up for by strong language comprehension or vice versa. Older struggling readers may only be missing a few strands in the rope or just pieces of strands in the rope, but remember, they have to be fixed if we want good proficient readers overall. You can't ignore any weaknesses. They have to be fixed, and we have to isolate and figure out what those are and fix them for older struggling readers. So effective intervention is going to focus on those weaknesses and target them in isolation and fix those and to develop the rope to the strength that we're looking for. If a student is weak in both word recognition skills and language comprehension skills, then that's going to be two different interventions that are going to happen at different times. You cannot do it together. It's too complex. A student will not be able to think about comprehension if they're trying to think about turning the print into words at the same time. It just is too much for our brains. Okay, I see there was a question. I'm a K1 replacement reading teacher. If a student is unable to identify letters and letter sounds, should I still also focus on language comprehension or just word recognition? You need to do both, but not at the same time. So when you're teaching letter names and letter sounds, that's all you're going to be teaching at that particular moment. Then when you've spent enough time on that, then you can shift over to language comprehension. And of course, that will be oral at this point. And it can involve, all sorts of activities. I want to go, that brings a good point. The language comprehension thing. I wasn't getting into this, but I'm going to throw it in real quickly. There's an extension in the science of reading, in the research, of the simple view that a researcher called Kami developed, where he proposes the what he calls the narrow view of reading, which is that if we were to call reading instruction, only call word recognition reading instruction, everything else that we do in school and actually everything else that happens in life is actually language comprehension, because language comprehension composes world knowledge. People call it background knowledge. I prefer world knowledge because I don't think it's in the background. I think it's your life experience is language comprehension, because we think through language. We use language to express ourselves. We use language to explore, to learn. And so everything that we do in life is language comprehension development. Even in a gym class, you're developing language because you're learning rules to a game, you're learning about the body, you're developing things. So everything in life is language comprehension. There's this one thing that's required for reading that's called word recognition, which is the ability to turn the print into language. And Kami says that's what we should call reading instruction, because it's that set of skills, the neural pathways and processes that have to be developed, that once they are developed, are fixed and done, and then we no longer have to teach reading because we are reading to learn. And so it's another way to think about the reading instruction. But I hope that helps with the, should I work on just one or the other? You need to work on both. Just remember that they can't do both at the same time. Okay. Any other questions at this point before I move to our next section? Now would be a good time. If anybody has a question, you can just shout it out. Okay. Well, I hope I'm still making sense. If I'm not, you need to let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to keep on going. Okay. So I want to now start thinking about what are the early reading word recognition skills that we need to teach. Now that we've kind of laid that groundwork for the whole reading brain and the pieces and parts that go into it. So we're going to go back to my graphic, and we're going to think about teaching word recognition, which will start with the decoding and then evolve into word recognition. And we're going to break this down a little bit. So we know that for decoding, there are some skills that predate even being able to decode. And this goes back to our question of letter names and letter sounds. That's a pre-reading skill. So that would be taught here at the beginning. Once we have our pre-reading skills, and I'm going to define those for you in a moment, in place, then we start learning how to decode. And we do basic decoding. That's typically done with the short vowel pattern, the one vowel not at the end of a syllable that almost always spells the expected short vowel sound, because it's a one-to-one letter sound correspondence, and it makes it easy to figure out how to turn print into language. And once we've laid the pathways in the brain down here and started to develop automaticity, then we start bringing in typically some more complex vowel spellings, more complex spellings, and longer words, and then even some morphology. And that moves us into the word recognition stage. And then after that, once we've become exposed to and practiced all of the elements of the phonics realm, It's miles, what I call the miles on the page stage, where it's just read, read, read. And as you read, you learn more words, you learn more vocabulary, you develop more language, and it all just continues to grow. So breaking this down a little bit further, we know that in pre-reading skills also conveniently falls into two major domains: the orthographic, which is the print realm, the visual, and the phonological, which is the sound, which is the speech sounds. Those are the two domains that are going to make up our pre-reading skills, and I'm going to define that a little bit further for you. But both of those need to be established to a certain point in order for decoding instruction to begin. Once we have those in place, then we're going to start with single syllable words. And as I said, most programs will start with the short vowel pattern. Some people call it the closed syllable. And then as we're developing and mapping the pathways in the brain for how to turn print into language, we will get more complex. We'll bring in more complex spellings and more complex words, and continue to develop on through the phonics scope and sequence. So this is a typical logical way to approach reading instruction and learning. There is one element that I'll come back to in a moment and get into a little more detail, but of the phonological continuum that develops during decoding. And that is, we're going to look at this term called phonemic proficiency, and I'll give you some explanation of that in a minute, but I just trying to lay out the visual for us here. So there are basic phonological skills that happen pre-decoding, that happen in the pre-reading stage, but then there's some continued phonological awareness development that has to happen that David Kilpatrick calls phonemic proficiency, that needs to happen during the basic decoding stage. And we'll visit that in a minute and talk more about that. So before we map out these skills any further, it's important for me to talk about the idea that you know that all of the students that come to you, no matter what grade you're teaching, are not in the same place. And if you want to be effective in your instruction, you need to assess and figure out where those students are in this map, and where they might have weaknesses if you're going to meet their needs and fix any weaknesses they have and continue to develop them. If you jump in above where they are, you're going to confuse them. If you jump in too low, you're going to bore them and they will misbehave and become frustrated. You need to hit the magic sweet spot. And if you remember from teaching school, Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, that's the sweet spot. It's where what you know meets what you don't know. And it's the only place we can learn. So we need to do assessment, and I'm going to come back and revisit assessment with our assessment map in a minute. But it's really important not to assume that students have skills, particularly if you're working with older students. I first learned to teach reading with adult non-readers. So I had adults who didn't have what we would consider kindergarten skills. And that's where I had to start. I couldn't, treat them as adults. I treated them as adults, excuse me. I couldn't teach them the skills as if they were adults. I had to go back and teach them what was missing from kindergarten. So we're going to do that. Okay. In the handout, the last page is a blow up of what I'm going to show you now, our pre-reading skills map. This is a map we put together because, again, I'm a visual learner and it helps me to have things organized visually to understand them. So this is pre-reading skills and beginning reading skills map. It goes, the skills develop from the top going down. So at the very top is the easiest, and at the bottom is going to be more complex. We break the map into pre-reading skills, which is the top bar and the two boxes underneath of that. And then phonics, which is word recognition or decoding. and that's divided into two boxes under the purple bar. So I'm going to go back to my other graphic and just relate it to that. So we've got pre-reading skills, basic decoding skills, and we don't go all the way through advanced decoding on this map. This is beginning reading skills. So we're probably about halfway through or getting into the advanced decoding skills on this graphic, on the other graphic. Okay, foundational skills, pre-reading skills starts with what I call the non-negotiable pre-reading skills that must be mastered before decoding instruction will be effective. And this is the first place that I think we start to lose some of our students in the reading instruction game, is they don't get enough practice or and teaching with the pre-reading skills before we start phonics instruction, and they're lost in phonics because they haven't developed the necessary pre-reading skills. So if you think back to the rope, that very beginning where things were separate, and our question in here about letter names and letter sounds, that's a pre-reading skill. That has to be developed before we can ask those students to start decoding, because if they don't know what the letter names and letter sounds are, they certainly aren't going to be able to decode. And that seems pretty obvious, but it gets overlooked sometimes in the push for keeping the pace and guide. So the non-negotiable skills fall into two domains, as I said. I'm not going to elaborate these for you. I trust that you guys have been exposed to these. If you have questions, please bring them up, or my email's on the cover slide, and you can reach me. But phonological skills, which is, again, the speech sounds, the awareness of the speech sounds. The orthographic skills, which is the visual component, which is simply letter names, letter sounds. And in our map will involve only 10 basic high frequency words, not 72. You only need 10 free reading skills to start phonic, 10 high frequency words. And I'll talk about that real quickly in a minute. But so going back to the map, you will see that there is a continuum under phonological, syllable, onset, rhyme, and phoneme. This is probably familiar for you. We would include in that first and last sound identification. That is the domain and the sequence of instruction for phonemic awareness prior to phonics instruction. And then on the, this is a reference slide, just gives you a little more detail about phonological in case you aren't familiar with the term. The phonological awareness continuum is easiest is syllable, then more difficult onset rhyme, which is taking a syllable, and the onset is all the sounds in a syllable before the vowel sound, and the rhyme is the vowel sound and any sounds after it. So if we had the word mop, the would be the onset, and the op would be the rhyme. The rhyme is what rhymes, R-H-Y-M-E. And then the most complex is the phoneme, which is the individual sounds within a syllable. That's what the letters and the spelling patterns represent, and that's why students have to be able to work at the phoneme level. To be able to decode, they have to be able to tune in to the individual sounds in a spoken word. Now, I said I was going to talk about two different terms for phonemic awareness, and the two terms are phonemic awareness, and this is the basic necessary for pre-reading skills for to be ready for decoding. Students must be able to identify, blend, and segment phonemes orally. So that means that if I give them three sounds, they can tell me instantly that that's rat. If I give them a word top, they can easily tell me the sounds are if I give them a word thick, they can tell me the first sound is and the last sound is k, and then that leaves the middle sound I. So they need to be able to operate without print orally at that level to start phonics. If they are struggling with that, they are going to struggle with phonics. And this is one of the places, as I said, I think we lose some kids because they aren't strong enough with this ability yet to then apply it to print. and then they get lost. Now, the second term I want to introduce you to is the phoneme proficiency. And phonemic proficiency is a term that David Kilpatrick, who's done a lot of research and review the research in this area, has proposed for being able to go beyond just blending and segmenting sounds orally to being able to manipulate them. And that would include adding sounds, deleting sounds from a word, substituting sounds. So changing bat to bit, oh, the ah changed to I, and being able to instantly recognize that that's what's happened. This, according to Kilpatrick's research, which is very strong, is absolutely necessary for automatic proficient reading. So if we want a good, strong reader, not just a decoder, but a strong reader, the student must develop the phoneme manipulation skills. Now, according to Kilpatrick, our readers fall into two camps: those that don't struggle and those that struggle with learning to read. And what Kilpatrick tells us, and I certainly have seen this in my personal experience, is struggling readers do not automatically develop the phoneme proficiency and must be taught how to manipulate sounds explicitly. However, a typically developing reader, one who doesn't struggle, they seem to develop the ability to do phoneme manipulation through decoding. Once they start decoding and the understanding of print representing the sounds somehow translate to them being able to understand, oh, the difference between the word bit and bat in print is the vowel sound, I and ah, and they map that automatically, and they don't struggle with it. But if you have a struggling reader, one of the things I encourage you to look at is this phoneme proficiency. Can they manipulate sounds? And I think you'll find often that they cannot if you haven't taught them. And if you teach them, they will move further and faster in their word recognition ability. And why is it important? From our understanding from the research is that once you are a proficient reader, what makes you a proficient reader is that when you see an unfamiliar word in print, you are automatically able to start processing that print, turn it into speech sounds, and map the sounds of the word to the print that you're looking at in your brain very quickly. And then if it's a word you know, you also map in the meaning, and you develop what the researchers call, it's an awkward term, mental orthographic image. And it really should be mental semantic orthographic image, because it's not just the print, it's also the meaning, and it's also the phonological. But it's the combination of the sound of the word mapped to the print of the word, tied to the meaning of the word, and you own that word after only a couple of exposures. So even if it's an unfamiliar word, if you're a good reader, you'll encounter the word, you'll get a reasonable pronunciation for the word, and you'll own the word. Now, it may not be an accurate pronunciation for the word. I read the word epitome as epitome for a long, long time because I had never heard it orally, but I knew what it meant, and I read it accurately every time I got to it. I just didn't have the right pronunciation in my brain, and I had to shift that, but I owned that word after a couple of exposures. Now, beginning and struggling readers will take more repetitions to own a word because they're not doing the automatic mapping. And how do we get to the automatic mapping? Part of that is going to involve that phonemic proficiency. And the reason is that if you have phonemic proficiency, you are able to instantly do the mapping that needs to happen. But if you don't have the phonemic proficiency, that means that your phoneme ability is slower and you're not able to do that in mapping in the instant way that it needs to happen. And that's going to keep you a struggling reader. So these mental orthographic images are really the true sight words. They're all the words that you as a reader own, that you see them in print and you don't have to think, I have to sound that word out. So encyclopedia, all the fancy words, that you just see them in print and you automatically, they pop into your brain. Those are all mental orthographic images for you. And it means that you have mapped the spelling to the sound and then tied the meaning to it. And you own those words. So this is what makes proficient readers, is this instant mapping, the mental orthographic mapping. So one of the things when we think about developing a good reading brain is that we would need to make sure that in our early reading that we're getting automaticity with all the skills so that this process that we're trying to get to can happen automatically. And the reason is that if you're having to still map out everything and slowly and effortlessly think about decoding, you have no brain space left to think about meaning and to develop comprehension from what you're reading. So phonemic proficiency is something to explore with struggling readers, and you may want to add it to your intervention instruction. Going back to our map, on the pre-reading skills map, on the orthographic side, this again is letter names, letter sounds, and then we at Readsters believe you only need to teach 10 simple high-frequency words before you start phonics instruction. And that will allow you to have students in very early decoding lessons start reading simple sentences. But you do not have to spend a lot of time having them memorize 72 unfamiliar words while they're still trying to figure out what the letters are. That doesn't make sense to us. Wait until they know their letter names and are learning their letter sounds, and then you can start teaching the 10 high frequency words, and they're right here on the map, one at a time. And that way, when you start phonics, they will know all their letter names, their letter sounds, and some basic high frequency words, and can even with early decoding, start reading sentences. Another reference slide there. We break high frequency words, and I don't have time to go into this today, but we break high frequency words into those that are going to be decodable in this early scope and sequence. And we don't teach those as memorized words. The only words we teach as memorized words are the heart words, which are the irregularly spelled high frequency words. And we will teach those alongside the phonics instruction once we start decoding instruction with phonics. So high frequency words are any words that occur frequently in text. Heart words are the irregularly spelled ones. Okay, I'm going to go just quickly through a little bit more of the map, and then we'll shift gears here. But in the map, moving past the pre-reading skills, starting phonics instruction, decoding instruction, we do, like most people, vowel consonant and CVC words, just single syllable words with the short vowel spelling pattern. And that typically would be kindergarten instruction. Now, this is critical, and this is another place we lose students. Sound by sound reading is not reading. Everybody just repeat that in your own brains for a second. Sound by sound reading is not reading. Sound by sound reading is a step along the way, but it's a beginning step. And if you have older readers who are still having to sound out unfamiliar words out loud to read them, they are stuck, and there are ways to fix them. And you can go to our website and find a session called Help My Students Stuck at Sound by Sound, and you can find out ways to help them. But they will need help. This is the other place we start losing students, is in the beginning decoding. Students are having to look at CVC words, and if it's an unfamiliar word, they have to say the sounds out loud. So say the word is rat, they're not familiar with it. They go rat to read the word. They are accurate and they're reading the words, but they're having to sound them out loud to read them. That is not reading, and we need to move past that stage. That all that process has to get internalized. So what I want to encourage you is that if you have a student who's still doing that, do not move on in your phonics instruction past this stage until they don't have to do that anymore. And like I say, you can go to our website and get some information from a recorded workshop there on how to fix that. But don't move on. Stay at this PVC level until you get that in all that process internalized. Once you do, then you can start adding your digraphs, your blends, start doing 2-syllable words with short vowels, teach schwa, add your schwa multi-syllable words. Now, on our map, we like to do R-controlled vowels as our first advanced vowel. We do it before silent E. We think this is easier for students than to read a vowel followed by an R, where it's 2 letters next to each other, versus a vowel consonant E, a split vowel pattern. But it really doesn't matter. Follow the scope and sequence that your program has. That's just our preference. Okay, we like to get into 3-syllable words before we even get to the vowel teams, because you can. Why wait? And then finally, silent E on the map. And then after silent E, you get your vowel teams and your advanced morphology and more complex stuff. So again, just pre-reading and early reading skills. But I want to go back to that CVC before you get to our control pattern. That is the key place to develop automaticity and mastery that I'm going to talk about in just a minute here, to get the neural pathways wired in without glitches and wire them in for accurate reading. This is where you're going to train your students to read accurately. Always read accurately, don't guess, where it becomes a habit and an automatic habit. And if you spend the extra time there with your students and develop the pathways and the processes there where the print is easy, relatively speaking, then when you get to advanced phonics, where the vowel spellings you have multiple spellings for the same vowel sound and and you have multiple letters spelling different vowel sounds and all the complexities of English, if the student has their basic decoding brain wired, they are simply learning to read new spelling patterns. They're not learning how to read. It's a difference. Learning how to read, learning how to decode, you want to do that where the print is simple, so that it's already established, so that when you get to longer words and advanced patterns, it's like you learning to read a foreign language that's spelled with the same alphabet as ours. You're just learning new spelling patterns that represent different sounds. You're not learning how to read. And that will make phonics so much easier for everyone. Now on the map, I want to point out that once students get through the 2-syllable words with schwa, typically developing students may actually be able to start reading leveled text along with their decodable text, because if they're typically developing, they have enough wiring of the decoding brain that they can become what David Scher calls self-learners, and they start to intuit some of the patterns, even if you haven't taught them to them yet, because their brain's wired to start accessing it. Doesn't mean you stop instruction, but it means that you can they can start to navigate some leveled text on their own and develop language comprehension through text. For your struggling readers, I would not start the leveled reading until they've gotten through the silent E pattern with explicit instruction and practice and are showing some mastery and automaticity there. So that's another way to look at this map as a guidance for thinking about instruction. And just tying this back to our learning with language, learning with oral language until students, for our quick, easy to learn students, they might be able to start picking up, learning by reading before you even start the advanced vowels to some degree with leveled language. But our struggling readers, I would stay with oral language for comprehension. And remember, decodables are not for language comprehension. Decodables are for practicing word recognition to accuracy. Okay, I'm going to spill into our 15-minute question time here. if that's all right, we haven't had a lot of questions, and that'll allow me to finish up the slides. I'm getting close, but I've got two more things I want to talk about. I do see a question about heart words. Heart words are an evolving list, correct? Yes, they are. You may want to teach some regularly spelled words as heart words, like, for instance, the word like is regularly spelled. It's a vowel consonant E pattern, but if your students need to know that word before you get to teaching vowel consonant E in your phonics, then yes, you might teach that as a heart word at that point before you get to that. Only thing I would say on that is don't hold your Tommy Turtles accountable for knowing like. If they need help with it, give it to them. There's a difference between holding someone accountable for it and teaching it to them and helping them when they need it. And I don't want them to get frustrated and struggling over the word like. If they don't figure it out until they learn about vowel consonant E, that's okay. You can help them. Okay, we have another question. I'm always struggle with the idea of assigning comprehension goals. Sorry, I'm reading this question. Everybody can see it in the chat there. Okay, I'm going to have to come back to that question if you don't mind, because I got to process it a second, and my brain's still on the slides. I'd rather finish the slides if that's all right. So I will come back, Alicia, to your question. And I will also address syllable types at the end. So let me just finish up the slides here, and then I'll come back to those questions. I just want to show you how to think about diagnostic assessment with our map. Remember that if you are trying to figure out what a student is weak in, you need to do diagnostic assessment, which is not the same as your screening assessment. A doctor would never operate on you just because he's taken your temperature and said, "Oh, you have a fever." He's going to figure out why you have a fever before he does anything. So going back to our simple view, because it always goes back to the simple view. If you think about the simple view, there are three questions when you think you have a struggling reader that you need to ask yourself. Is the problem word recognition? Is the problem language comprehension? Or is it both? Because it could be on both domains. So everybody, I want you to just take a second and repeat these questions for yourself in your own brain or out loud if you want. So the three questions are: the problem word recognition? Is the problem language comprehension, or is it both? That sets you up for thinking about how to do diagnostic assessment. Our question map is a visual to help you think about a flow for diagnostic assessment. This is on page 11 in your handout. So question is, do I think there's a reading problem? Those of you that use something like Dibbles or AimsWeb or one of those CBMs, that's a screening assessment, which will answer the question is this first question: do I think there is a reading problem? If that diagnostic, that screener says we think there is a reading problem, then you're going to ask your big three questions. Is it word reading, word recognition or decoding? Is it language comprehension, or is it both? Now you're going to need to do a diagnostic assessment to answer those three questions. The easier diagnostic is the decoding or word recognition, because that's a fixed set of skills. And I'm going to share two informal ones that you can have access to for free in just a second. But you give a diagnostic, words in isolation, so that meaning is not involved. And you find out where in that continuum of decoding skills is your student. Are they in the beginning decoding stage? Are they in the advanced word recognition stage? And how severe are their weaknesses in that stage? And that will guide you to the appropriate instruction. If they are so weak on the decoding diagnostic, you may want to give a pre-reading skills diagnostic assessment, and we have a free one of those available on our website called the Pre-Reading Probe, so I'll give you access to that in a minute. And then you will find out from that, is it a weakness in the phonological realm? Is it a weakness in the orthographic realm? Or is it both? And that will guide you to your intervention instruction. So if they're in the pre-read, if they're missing something in the pre-reading skills, you're going to do pre-reading instruction before you go back to phonics. If it's early phonics, that's where your intervention is going to be. If it's advanced phonics, that's where your intervention needs to be. Now, on the language comprehension side, it's a little more complex from the assessment component, but I do think there's some basic questions that will guide you if you see that there appears to be a language comprehension weakness. And the questions are, is it vocabulary and world knowledge? Or is it on the syntax and reasoning side? And I'm going to explain that in a second. Or both. Because again, it can be both. I think somebody put something in about language comprehension in the chat. They're looking for a program. I'll address that in a second too. Okay. The language of comprehension assessment is complex, and I don't have much to recommend in the way of doing that. A lot of it can be observational, but I would recommend you look at, I have not had the opportunity to really work with this, but Acadience Learning has a new assessment that seems like it might be quite helpful called the CFAL, Comprehensive Fluency in Oral Language Assessment. Here's the website for it, link. Check that out. How do we address language comprehension issues? Just broadly, if it's vocabulary and world knowledge, teach Tier 2 vocabulary that's appropriate to the world knowledge that they need to know. Preview any vocabulary that is critical to understanding in the text, and then provide world knowledge that's critical to understanding the text. So in other words, this will be based on what text the students are having to understand. If they don't have the prerequisite vocabulary and world knowledge, pre-teach it. That's pretty straightforward. On the syntax and reasoning side, syntax is how words arranged in order affect meaning. And so basically, this is how do sentences work. And that can be taught whole group. I would refer you to the work of William Van Cleve, who unfortunately has passed on, but left a great body of work and some really good instruction for teaching syntax at the sentence level. And that can be taught whole group in the classroom, but also can be taught more specialized as intervention for students who need to catch up. But that's the essence of understanding complex text, is understanding syntax. And that can be taught along with writing skills. So as you're learning to read complex sentences, you can learn how to write complex sentences, and that reinforces each other. A true language reasoning deficit, that probably is going to require a specialized intervention for someone who is trained in language processes at the thinking level, and is not going to be a classroom intervention. Of assessing decoding. Decoding, you must assess with words in isolation to take meaning out of the picture. You want to look at short vowels and digraphs and blends. You want to look at multisyllable word attack. You want to look at advanced vowels. Also watch for BD confusion. And then also reading sound by sound, because the student may be able to do words accurately, but are doing sound by sound. And remember, that's not reading. Two assessments that I would recommend is one that we wrote when we were at Really Great Reading called the Diagnostic Decoding Surveys. They give Form A free. Or we have just developed this past year our new decoding detector, which is free. You'll have to email me for that because we haven't quite put it together on the website yet, but because we're still tweaking it slightly, but feel free to email me and I'm happy to share it. It's similar to the diagnostic decoding surveys, but we've simplified things. And I'm a great believer in get the assessment simplified and get to instruction. You'll also, of course, need an oral reading assessment for any students grade middle grade 1 and up, so that you know what's happening with connected text. And we use things like Dibbles and Ames Web and Acadians. If you think there's pre-reading skills that need to be assessed, on our website, you can access the pre-reading probes. It will assess phonological and orthographic skills and the 10 high frequency words, so you can see if they're ready for phonics. Don't skip the pre-reading skills if you think a student is missing them. And I have worked with older, and I'm talking even adults, that were missing pre-reading skills. So you cannot assume that a struggling reader has all their pre-reading skills if they're showing enough weakness in their decoding. Okay, quickly on, I'm getting a little behind here, but I'm going to wrap it up here. My last topic is systematic explicit instruction and automaticity and mastery. Just quickly on systematic instruction, this is a critical piece of the science of reading, and that is shown in this graph, that direct instruction, which is a form of explicit instruction, has very high effect in student achievement versus other types of instruction. You guys probably know explicit instruction: I do, you do, we do. I just want to propose one thing you might not have thought about, and this ties again to our mastery and automaticity, is that when students are in the mastery phase, which is the early phase of developing automaticity, they may be this is the phase at which they're accurate, but they may be slow and have to think about what they're doing. And that's the phase in which the you-dos need guided feedback. So that requires you-dos with the teacher listening to what's going on and providing immediate corrective feedback. Once a student has demonstrated basic mastery, they can start to do independent you-do practice, which doesn't require the teacher monitoring every thing that they're doing, because it's just miles on the page, if you will. It's more practice of whatever the skill is, but you can rely from their mastery that they're doing it correctly. They just need to keep doing it until it becomes automatic. And so to explain what we mean from the, well, let me just, I'm getting out of order here. Okay, systematic instruction also would be teaching in small steps, developing mastery before you move to the next step. Automaticity can be developed while you're teaching a new step, so continued practice. And that's what things like our map are set up for, to have you do this in a logical developmental way that makes sense. So mastery and automaticity. Mastery is being able to do it accurately. However, it may be slow and effortful. And this is where you're going to need the immediate corrective feedback, so that if you make a mistake, you do get it right. Once you're confident that the student is being accurate most of the time, you can release them to independent practice where they keep doing the task, but you know that they're doing it right and they're just getting faster at it, that they're being able to do it automatically. And automaticity is being able to do it without thinking about it. And I think the best analogy for that is driving. You guys can all drive and do other things while you're driving that have nothing to do with driving, because your driving skills are automatic. They happen without your conscious thought. Guessing is a bad habit. It needs to be fixed if it's already developed. For young readers, we need to nip it in the bud and make sure it doesn't develop. And that's part of what decodable text is for, is to develop accuracy to mastery and then to automaticity, because we know they can be accurate. Last slide to share is some resources that you can get to on our website. And that allows me to wrap up. And I have literally gone to the last minute.